And we are live, back with another weekly Boxing Squared live stream Friday night here in New Zealand. Wherever you are in the world, welcome. Thank you for joining the live stream, I should say. I guess it's Halloween in some parts of the world when this is going on, so it could be a live stream. But thank you for joining me wherever you are. Hope you're having a good day, a good night, and let's talk some boxing. I've got a number of topics that I wanted to canvass in the next sort of 35 or 40 minutes. I want to just have a little bit of a shorter stream today. I went for a couple of hours the other week, and I'll just try to condense it a little bit. There's also a big rugby match involving my team, the All Blacks, that I do want to catch on delay. But let's get into it. So a number of topics that I do want to canvass. So we have Deontay Wilder and Luis Ortiz building towards their fight. A good turnout for the first sort of preview on Fox of that fight. Over 2 million people watched that. We have Michael Hunter. He's been sparring with Andy Ruiz Jr. and also he's going to be fighting Alexander Povetkin. And Ruiz Jr. himself has lost apparently 30 pounds according to his trainer Manny Robles. We'll get to some Patreon questions, and I want to touch on my intro because in terms of my video intro, a number of comments from concerned subs that have thought that I've changed it. It was just for a specific video, but I'll come to that. Alexander Povetkin, what chance do we give him against Michael Hunter? Povetkin is the aging fighter here. Not too much to note this weekend in terms of matchups, but I'll quickly touch on Martin Bakole and Rodney Hernandez. Filip Hrgović and Eric Molina also added to the Ruiz Jr. and Joshua rematch card. And Australian heavyweight Dempsey McKean has called out his fellow Australian heavyweight Lucas Brown. He wants a fight at short notice, but it looks like either way, it'll probably happen in 2020 if it doesn't happen in the next week or so, which Lucas Brown is saying thanks, but no thanks. So I'll just get to the chat here. So a whole bundle of people who are in the chat already, 24. Thank you for joining me here. Okay, I'll just get to the first topic. So Deontay Wilder, Luis Ortiz, they're going to have this pay-per-view November 23rd on Fox. This first episode of a 4-part series, 2.2 million people tuned in to that episode. It's the highest ever for a Fight Camp PBC episode ever. So this is a pretty good showing for this fight. I know a lot of us have been talking about the sort of a lack of interest, or at least the perceived lack of interest in this fight. Not so much because it's not a good fight, but more we've seen the fight before. And $75 if you're in America to pay to see that again. It sort of seems people are a little bit lukewarm on it. But obviously on Fox, this Fight Camp preview, the first episode, has had a pretty good response. That's a good response to this fight, and obviously the biggest episode in their history of this certain series. So, I mean, does this translate to additional buys? I mean, is this going to be something that people are sort of misinterpreting the interest, or is this just because maybe there was nothing else on and people were sort of settled in watching it? It was on for free. It wasn't a pay-per-view, that this was something that they could have a look at, but maybe necessarily some of those people won't buy the pay-per-view. And given Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder's first pay-per-view, that was Wilder's first ever, did 325,000. I'm not suggesting that a whole bundle of extra people are going to buy the Fox pay-per-view just because it's on a different network and because people have watched this episode. But I did think that this sort of bodes well for the pay-per-view. Maybe there will be a little bit more interest than generally is thought. A lot of people are thinking around 200,000 buys, but yeah, I think that surprised a few people in terms of the interest. At 2.2 million people watching that first episode of the Wilder-Ortiz Fight Camp preview. What did you make of it? Let me know in the chat, and I will get to the chat now. So I can't answer everyone who said hello, so just anyone who said hello in the chat, hello back to you as well. So Themis Lofi says Wilder vs Ortiz will be banger, don't miss it. Yeah, I think a lot of boxing fans will probably end up watching it. If not paying for it, they'll find other means to do so. But yeah, it's a good fight. It's not maybe the best fight that Deontay Wilder could have been involved in, but it's certainly not a terrible fight. And I have seen a number of people sort of rubbishing it. Ortiz is still a top 10 fighter. But I guess the $75 price tag for a fight people have already seen and was a conclusive result, it probably is going to turn some people off. That's just the reality. I don't believe this is the sort of buzz that there was ahead of the first fight. But, it doesn't mean that it's not a good fight, but it's probably going to do less than the Fury and Wilder fight. I mean, I would suggest it would, but ultimately time will tell. Okay, so getting to the chat here, and Adam Fahey says, smash that like button. Yes, please. So Let's Visit says, okay, I miss a few people talking to each other here. So Marvin says, Ortiz looks a decade older. I still wouldn't rule out a Wilder KO loss, though. Yeah, Luis Ortiz does look like a very old-looking 40-year-old in some ways, but then again, there's some other Cuban fighters, but I mean, who knows how old he really is, but he is still a quality fighter. But wouldn't that really upset the apple cart? That would be something that would shake up the heavyweight division again. I mean, we've seen it this year that a fighter can go in there, seemingly everyone is confident for a certain result. I'm picking Deontay Wilder to win again. I'm picking him to win faster again. But Luis Ortiz is a quality fighter, and maybe he lands something telling, something that he can actually put Wilder away with, something that he couldn't land in the first fight or couldn't finish him off with. He had some good moments in that 7th round, and let's hope that it is another good fight. And it really was a fight of two halves last time, because I think a lot of people forget that it was kind of a 5-round fight in terms of action, because the first 4-5 rounds until the end of that 5th round, it was a pretty low-volume fight, and there were actually boos in the crowd because it was so tactical. And I could see it being tactical again, because Ortiz, knowing that this might be his last grasp attempt for a world title, he may play it cool again. And Wilder, as we know, he does like to size up opponents, look for the openings, and when he pulls the trigger, he can sometimes really land something of note, something to change the course of the fight. So getting back to the comments here. So JPK says, do you think a Coley moving to heavyweight is a good idea? I think it's an inevitability. I mean, he's a pretty big cruiserweight at 6'5", but at the moment, I mean, who wants to see a Coley? That's the thing for him. He's just got zero buzz. He's sucked the life out of a couple of fight cards, had a couple of really dreadful performances. And before that knockout on the card the other week, it was another, hug fest from a Coley. People just, in my view at the moment, people are down on a Coley, and people don't necessarily want to see him. It's going to be hard for him to actually build a fan base in terms of the way that he fights, because don't get me wrong, he's incredibly effective, and what he does, it neutralizes his opponent, but at the end of the day, it's an entertainment sport. And we've seen him with that fight, which was against Matty Askins, and then there was that card, I think there was that British Beef card, which was against Isaac Chamberlain back in February 2018. He didn't have a great 2018, and when I was watching that fight just the other day for the European title, I was thinking, geez, why am I putting myself through this? And then obviously, what was it, the 7th round, he landed something really telling, changed the fight, and I actually felt sorry for his opponent. His name just escapes me for the moment, because he was the champion. He got caught with a big right hand, but he wasn't given the opportunity to sort of recover. I mean, he may have been taken out and maybe brutally in the following seconds, but the referee was right in there, and I thought for a champion, it sort of seemed a bit quick. Maybe he could have been given an opportunity to respond, but ultimately it is what it is. But in terms of Lawrence Okolie at heavyweight, it's not something that I can say that I'm sort of going to put in my calendar and wait for. It kind of feels like he's just going to keep doing what he does even up at heavyweight. But at heavyweight, he won't have such advantages that he does at cruiserweight. I'm sure he will pick up a world title at some point at cruiserweight, but I think his heavyweight prospects, they are certainly a little less clear. Just getting back to the chat here. So Ortiz looked good at the public workout today. I've seen some photos. I haven't seen the film yet. I'm probably going to do a video on some of his comments tomorrow. There's a press release and some photos that's come out. Haven't managed to get to it today. But yeah, I think Ortiz, it's his, he's got to put everything into it. He's got to, this is kind of the last hurrah. I mean, I do believe if he gets knocked out and gets knocked out brutally, it probably is the end of the road for Luis Ortiz. And I know some sort of Luis Ortiz fans or fanboys of PBC will sort of say, oh, well, it's only a second loss. Other people don't want to fight him. But he's 40 years old. He's been on the decline. He doesn't look as good as he did, say, 18 months ago or 4 years ago, for example. The clock is ticking, and a brutal KO, it could be the end of the road. Just my view. I mean, you don't have to agree, but I don't think there'll be too many more places to go in terms of getting title shots after another knockout loss. And if he is just competing for money at this point, over 40, and he hasn't got enough in the bank after this fight, I don't want to see this guy keep going on and on and on. There's a number of fighters that we've seen do that and are continuing to do that, and sometimes you think it's time to hang it up. But I guess money and other things and other requirements in people's lives, for whatever reason, they continue to fight over to them in their career. But sometimes, and I think we've all seen it, fighters do go on a little too long. So if he does get knocked out, I think he will retire, but that remains to be seen. Let me know what you think about that. Should Ortiz retire if he gets knocked out brutally? Okay, we've got L-Dog saying, imagine if we got a Ruiz versus Ortiz unification. See, that's the thing. It wouldn't happen. Deontay Wilder has got a rematch clause in his back pocket. He's also got a rematch clause in his back pocket for any Tyson Fury fight if it happens in February 2020 or whenever, should he get past Luis Ortiz. So Deontay Wilder can fight with freedom because he knows, even though if he does lose the belt, it may only be a temporary situation because he can always get it back through a rematch. So Adam Fahey says, Ortiz is like Povetkin, world level, top 10 for 5 rounds. Yeah, I mean, certainly both those guys, I think we've seen it in recent fights, they're at their most dangerous when they're early and fresh. The later the fight goes, the volume sort of drops, and then it becomes, they do what a lot of good boxers do, especially aging boxers. They fall back on their skills. And I was in a video earlier today that I did about Alexander Povetkin and Michael Hunter. I sort of think that Hunt is going to take over in the sort of back end of that fight if it goes past half a dozen rounds. Someone like Hughie Fury wasn't able to sort of do that to Alexander Povetkin, but in a way that showed Povetkin's class. Even though his gas tank was running sort of low, he was still able to maneuver and outmaneuver Hughie Fury and get the job done. So Marvin says, I think Deontay too, but would not be blown away if it all went wrong. Okay, I'm not sure what that's in response to. Callum, responding to someone else. So Eman99 says, and Ortiz would be bad for boxing. If Wilder won a rematch, he would avoid everyone until retirement. Well, if Luis Ortiz wins, it would be another massive upset in 2019 for heavyweight boxing. The odds are, I think, longer than the first fight, and Ortiz is 18 months older and seemingly more on the decline. But, it's a funny old thing, this boxing game, because a few things that we didn't think would happen, and, you can never say never, and you can never rule anything out in boxing. Often, the strangest things happen. And sometimes, for example, from a year or two ago, if you'd have proposed some of the fights and who'd be a champion and that sort of stuff 2 years out, to who it actually is, you'd say, nah, you're crazy. It would never happen. But it does. So Crown Admirer says, if you check Wilder's box numbers, the Fury fight was one of the lowest pay-per-view buys for Wilder. Lowest pay-per-view buys for Wilder. That was his only pay-per-view. So Toby says hi from the UK. Hi to everyone else who has joined and is part of the chat here. 39 there. If you can please hit the like button, that would be much appreciated. I'll go for about another half an hour or so. There's a big rugby game with the All Blacks, which I'm very keen to watch on delay. But a couple of other topics that I wanted to get through. So we've talked about Wilder Ortiz in the Fight Camp preview video, or I should say piece, which did 2.2 million views. Very good numbers. So Michael Hunter and Alexander Povetkin will move there next, added to the Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz Jr. rematch card. I like the fight. Also, we have Filip Hrgović and Eric Molina also added to that card. Don't like the fight as much, but in terms of activity and adding a resume builder type fight to his resume, it's not a bad one for Filip Hrgović. Molina has, 2 title challenges on his record, although, short notice opponent for Anthony Joshua. He was an overmatched opponent versus Deontay Wilder, did better than expected in that fight, but still came up short both times and really has been inactive, not really been doing too much in the past couple of years. Obviously, there was the UCAD ban with the substance that was in the vitamin B12, which he purchased over the counter, didn't even bother to check what was in the ingredients, dexamethasone. got a UCAD ban, which he just, as we did covered last week, had a month added to it. So his ban for UCAD, which won't affect him fighting in Saudi Arabia, it's up at the end of next month. But for Hrgović, so we'll just get there first. Yeah, it's an okay fight in terms of it's his 10th fight. He's the level of competition that he's faced has been maybe on a par or maybe slightly less than Eric Molina. We don't really know where Molina's at, but I'm fully expecting him to get iced. Filip Hrgović fought Mario Heredia, that was back in August, and prior to that Greg Corbin back in May, and those are his only 2 fights so far, and then count the Molina one, 3 for the year. A little bit low volume for Filip Hrgović, and that takes me actually to, I'll get back to the Povetkin fight in a moment, but a question from Patreon from L-Dog, who asks, with Filip Hrgović having a rather lackluster 2019, what do you think 2020 has in store for him? And also your thoughts on Hrgović versus Molina. Well, I've pretty much given those, but I think Hrgović is going to ice Molina, iron him out in under 2 or 3 rounds. I don't think it's going to be anything but a spectacular knockout. I think Hrgović will hit him with a couple of right hands, and then he either goes down on the canvas rather meekly, or he shells up and ultimately gets picked apart and taken out. In terms of the lackluster 2019, it has been a bit of a disappointment. I think for many, him joining Matchroom on the co-promotional arrangement with Sauerland, you thought that, it was going to lead somewhere that would be better than what Sauerland had been doing. But so far, the opponents, Corbin and Heredia, that's the sort of opponents that Team Sauerland could have organised for Hrgović without the involvement of Matchroom. So I think it's been a little bit undercooked for Filip Hrgović in 2019. 2020, well, let's hope that it can actually sort of pick up for him, because he needs to be, at 10 fights and he's still a prospect. He still needs some seasoning, because when you look at his record, he's only got 30 rounds on his resume. So he needs a few more, challenging fights, some good solid either journeyman or sort of fringe contenders, someone he can get half a dozen rounds against. Because I think in terms of Molina, if this was Molina from 4 or 5 years ago, it would be a much, much better fight, but it's clearly not. I think Eric Molina at this point is looking to sort of trade on his name, get a paycheck, and I think this one ends pretty meekly in a couple of rounds. But 2020, hopefully a much better year for Hrgović, because 2019 hasn't been much chop, and as so can often happen in a big heavyweight stable, because Matchroom with the heavyweights in the United States and also in the UK/Europe, they've got about 20 guys on the books, and Hrgović, while he's a talent, he sort of is down further on the depth chart and seemingly struggling to sort of put himself above the rest. So one thing he can do to help himself is obviously impress on December the 7th, and hopefully into a bigger and better sort of 2020. Well, let's hope so. Okay, I'll just get to a question from Toby on Patreon, who asks, I have some fantasy fights for you to predict. Lennox Lewis versus Ali, Lewis versus Foreman, Lewis versus Frazier, Lewis versus Prime Tyson. There's also a couple others here, but I'll address that first. I'm very reticent to, do fantasy fights in terms of predicting what would happen, because predicting different fights across different eras can, it's very tricky, and just the different circumstances at the time, the different era that each was in, even different, sports science, training techniques. And I think Lennox Lewis, along with these other guys, all-time greats. But predicting some of these guys across eras, it is certainly fraught. So I'm a little reluctant to go in on that, but I think Lewis probably does well against most of those guys. And in terms of, there's a few others here, Sugar Ray Leonard and Thomas Hearns versus Mayweather, Pacquiao, Crawford and Spence. For some of the same reasons, in terms of the cross sort of generations type fights, I'm reluctant to sort of do picks for the reasons I just outlined. But Crawford versus Spence, please, that would be great. It sort of seems like they're going to be building towards that, marinating as it were until 2021, or who knows when. Maybe it will never get made. Maybe that will end up being one that happens in 2 or 3 years' time, and we kind of go, well, maybe they missed their peak, because it's not like Crawford and Spence are sort of, 27, 28 years old. These guys are a little older than I think a lot of people think, and for these guys at the lower weights, once they start sort of touching towards the mid-30s, it maybe is slightly getting past prime, but that fight, hopefully we do see it. At the moment, given some of what we'd seen, I'm leaning towards Crawford, but, it would be a hell of a fight. I'll probably change my mind on that and go back and forth, because Spence, he's proven he's versatile, he can fight different styles, and he is very effective. Okay, getting back to the chat, which I'll no doubt be woefully behind. Okay, so who do you think is, this is from Let's Visit, I think Usyk has more chance against in his title fight. Well, it depends who he gets, because it could ultimately be through the WBO, where he's the mandatory. He could fight for a vacant title, and that's probably his best option at this point. He'd probably fancy his chances against, I know some people think that he may end up fighting Derek Chisora. That only happens if Derek Chisora ends up being the next highest ranked guy that he could fight for the title. And at the moment, Chisora is not ranked in the WBO top 15, but after picking up that Intercontinental strap, he will surely go into the top 10. But will he go as high as number 4? Because if he passes Joseph Parker, then we can really have a conversation about could he face Alexander Usyk. But if it was Ruiz Jr. and Joshua, I think he would probably fancy his chances more against Andy Ruiz Jr. just because the height and reach advantages he would carry into that fight. And it's not to say that he would win that fight, but I think he would maybe have a better chance of nullifying what Ruiz could do, because obviously, the reach disadvantage he'd have against Joshua is something he'd have to overcome, whereas against Ruiz, he would have the advantage. So Ropeburn says a Wilder win will do little to enhance his reputation amongst those who understand boxing legacy in the broader context. And there is something to be said in that. There is a bit of a point there. It's a good fight with Luis Ortiz, but it's not one that necessarily needed to happen. Deontay Wilder at the time that he announced that was trying to build towards a fight with Anthony Joshua for Undisputed in 2020. Those plans have obviously gone out the window, and given he'd publicly said he's fighting Ortiz, the fight sort of makes even less sense than maybe it otherwise would have in terms of trying to build towards something. But he says he needs to clear up his controversial fights. Sure, there were some seconds where Deontay Wilder was granted some extra time as the doctor came to the canvas after round 7 to check Wilder if he is okay. But as Luis Ortiz has noted, he also benefited from those extra seconds. He was sucking in the big ones there, ultimately knocked out in the 10th round. Pretty conclusive fashion too. So L-Dog says, Wilder will destroy Ortiz. I don't rate Ortiz anymore. I think that last KO he suffered against Wilder took so much out of him. Yeah, it's sort of hard to know, because the opposition from Ortiz has been at a certain level, but we haven't seen him against another top 10. And some of that is, often out of his control. He is a dangerous and risky fighter, and often it's considered that there's not a lot on the line for the risk versus reward equation. It's boxing after all, prize fighting. A lot of these fighters want to get well paid, and Ortiz, some of his paydays that he could offer them would be lower than other options that are available out there. And that just happens to be a reality within boxing. And it kind of has marred Luis Ortiz's career, but I do think sometimes the promotional sort of push that he's had, Dade Promotions that manages him, maybe it hasn't always been, things haven't panned out how they would have liked. But clearly with a second title shot, you can't complain with that. Hopefully he's getting something close to the $7 million that he turned down for an Anthony Joshua fight. But ultimately, I do think that Deontay Wilder wins that rematch, and I think in conclusive fashion, faster than the first time around. But, who knows? It's heavyweight boxing. We could all be proven wrong with these predictions, but I don't think it goes the distance either way. Jim Blomqvist says, who is more likely to adjust after the first fight? I think Ortiz has a better boxing brain, is more likely to adjust. Wilder will rely on his power. I think there may be an upset. Well, I think some of what Deontay Wilder's game plan will be similar to the first fight. I think there will be some low volume rounds early on as he looks to sort of, see what his prey is doing, his prey being Ortiz, of course. But in Wilder's interest is the fact that Ortiz has shown that he does gas in fights as the later the fights go. So if he does, I think that Wilder will sort of benefit from that. But obviously in a low-volume fight, that makes it easier for Ortiz to fight at a pace that he's comfortable at. But I do think that Deontay Wilder, I don't think he's going to vary his game plan drastically. I don't think he's going to come out and try to do what he did to Berman Stavern, what he tried to do to Dominic Breazeale, where he was really looking to decapitate those guys early on. I think he's going to show Luis Ortiz more respect, and it might mirror the early part of that first fight, which was low volume and a lot of people getting a little bit irritated in the crowd there. You could hear boos in that first fight. But Wilder, his ability to land a punch from across the ring at a moment's notice, it is underestimated. And a lot of people do like to sort of say, oh, he's power and nothing else, but he's got to land that punch, and he actually does a very good job, and his defense is underrated. So Marvin says, Okolie is awful to watch. Nobody wants the guy, despite Eddie doing his best to convince us he's exciting. And that's the thing, if he was all action, or at least some action in his fights before he manages to land a KO punch, yeah, maybe there would be more people on the Lawrence Okolie hype train, but he's taken the air right out of the hype balloon through his own actions. You just can't seem to stop himself from tying up. And it was quite funny in the post-fight. He admitted he was deliberately doing it as a tactic. But that might be effective. And there's a number of guys I think we can sort of look at in the, not just the heavyweight division, but in other divisions that are seemingly decent operators. They have certain tactics that they follow. They're effective, but they're destined to be undercard fighters just because it's an entertainment sport. Purists, only drive, a fan base so far. There's, a lot of us, I like seeing a good technical fight as much as the next guy, but at the end of the day, I like to see some decent action too, and the hugging from Lawrence Okolie, just don't want to see it. So moving on to the next question. A lot of people giving Povetkin stick, but when a 10-foot giant like Hughie Fury leans on you for 12 rounds, of course you're going to get tired. I think part of it is also that Alexander Povetkin is a 40-year-old now. We've seen it in recent fights. He starts off, he looks good when he's fresh, but he tires. And some of that is just because he is an older fighter now, but he has those skills to lean back on, as I mentioned. L-Dog says, Boxing Squared, I bet you're dying to see Okolie versus Hughie Fury. Well, that might be a sort of a good night, sort of bedtime story to put me away each night, because I don't think there'd be a lot of fighting in that fight. Jason Landis says, Ortiz is looking good, to be honest. Well, hopefully he comes and gives his all. It really is last chance saloon, I think, for a title shot. So Adam says, a brutal KO loss for Ortiz will see him back to his family. And if that's the case, I hope he goes back healthy and with some millions of dollars in his pocket. Who would win between Ortiz and Miller, and Ortiz versus Povetkin? I guess it depends when those fights were to occur, because if they happen right now, and if Jarrell Miller has anything in the tank after, the sort of PEDs are flushed out of his system, he might be a guy to sort of overwhelm Luis Ortiz like he does so many other fighters. Miller has proven he's got a very good chin. Ortiz versus Povetkin, it's a good fight. I guess it's one of these fights kind of like Povetkin versus Pulev, that these could have been fights that should have been made 2, 3, 4 years ago, but didn't. And Ortiz versus Povetkin, I think that one goes to points. I think that would be close. Thelemis Lofi says, it's the same folks here who didn't rate Ruiz till Ruiz won. Ortiz doesn't care who these bums rate anyway. Must be the end of the road for David Price now, surely. I would think so, but given he's basically, I don't want to say, his corner did save him from taking some punishment, but yeah, I can't say that I'm too interested to see Price at a sort of a similar level, just because I'm not sure he can really offer too much. And I would think it would be best for him to retire. But sorry, I'm just trying to find my place here. This chat window just all of a sudden spirals and I get way out of here. Okay, I'm back to where I was. Yeah, but back to Price. Sorry, I was kind of just umming and ahhing there. Yeah, I think it's time for him to hang it up. I'm not sure he'll get too many other opportunities at a similar level, but he's well aware of where his level is now. But is he willing to continue? He can trade on his name to some degree to get, some paydays that maybe they're not what he exactly would be after, but is there any point? If he really needs the money, maybe he will continue. And I think that's been part of why he has continued. But yeah, I think he should hang it up. Where are we now? So Ortiz has got a new strength and conditioning coach, but you can't turn back old Father Time. Yeah, Father Time is undefeated. Yeah, Ortiz a few months ago was looking a little bit sort of portly around the middle, and some of these recent promotional shots he is looking much trimmer, and he's grown his hair out a little bit too, so he kind of is looking a little bit different, but hopefully the strength and conditioning coach pays off for him. I think Julian J. Rock Williams is a good example of a guy who made some adjustments. He got a strength and conditioning coach, and he's really talked up how that's really changed his approach to his training, and it sort of paid dividends, and he was sort of saying, look, I'm more powerful than I've ever been. So Unger says Ortiz should retire after any loss, won't get a title shot or this type of money again, no point continuing. Well, if he's getting millions of dollars out of this year, it's certainly a strong argument for that. And if he gets knocked out brutally at 40 years old, it would appear his options would be limited. And it probably, kind of like Povetkin, I think either of these guys, if they're beaten, it just might be time to hang it up. Ortiz should have taken the AJ fight. He would have retired with a big payday. Well, maybe he would have been champion. I mean, if... remembering that was going to be short notice, stepping in there, and they were training for an orthodox fighter in Jarrell Miller, and Ortiz being a southpaw, that would have been a tricky fight for Anthony Joshua. JPK World says, okay, talking to someone else there, Ortiz should retire, but he won't. We would likely be fed Price versus Ortiz on a pay-per-view undercard or similar. Clearly being facetious there. I don't think that would happen. Okay, there's a few comments here about Ortiz retiring. So Unger says, not only is Ortiz 2 years older, but Wilder is 2 years better. Wilder KO inside 4. And I do think that there is something in that, because Deontay Wilder, his career has been, although a lot of fans have been sort of deriding the sort of way that he's been managed and brought along, but for a guy that stepped into the gym at 19 years old, the sort of development that he had, obviously winning that bronze medal, and then a real slow burn, as I would call it, I do think he is getting better. He has been getting better. I mean, it's not always obvious with some of the windmilling and all that sort of stuff, but he is definitely a much better fighter than when he became champion. I think, Deontay Wilder of 2018-2019 knocks Deontay Wilder of 2015 out. So True says, hi from Wales, I'm still up. Did you not go to bed there, True? Hopefully you're going to be watching that rugby a little bit later on. So Adam says, could honestly see Wilder in 1. Wow, that's a big call. So Lions in the camp. Is Tunde around? Or Anthony Yard? That's from Iman99. So God of War says Heyman will force Ortiz to retire. Ortiz, Wilder's whole resume, mind you. So Themalus Lofi says Wales will beat the All Blacks. Okay, now I actually expect it's going to be an exciting game, but I do think the All Blacks will end up running away with it. The whole sort of pressure is gone. I think there's a lot of changes that have been made on both sides, and I think it's going to be an entertaining game, but I think just the flair of the All Blacks, and we're getting away from boxing here, will just be too much for Wales in the end. Haven't had a win over them in 66 years, as keeps being pointed out in the news media. So Ungus is very disappointed for Hrgovic. Terrible matchmaking, needs to step it up quick. And that's on Eddie Hearn now. I do believe they do need to get better. And apologies, I'm way behind here on the comments, so I'll just try to whip through some of these. So L-Dog says, I predict Hrgovic will KO him in under 6 rounds. I think it'll be under 3 rounds. So True says, easy night's work for Hrgovic. Agree. Hrgovic could face a loser of Povetkin and Hunter if he gets through Molina. Yeah, I think Filip Hrgovic would fancy either of those guys in Hunter and Povetkin at this point. I guess it depends For example, if Michael Hunter ends up getting a decision over Alexander Povetkin, but it's a close fight, or either way, it might encourage Povetkin, win or lose, if he's in a good fight, to continue. He's clearly made no plans for 2020 and is hinging on this fight what he does next. But if he doesn't look good, and if it's if the legs are starting to betray him, Povetkin may retire. So Hrgović versus Peter Milas would be good in my eyes. I think in terms of a domestic dust-up in Croatia, that's going to be built towards at some point. I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing Filip Hrgović do that in 2020. I think Milas, he's a good fighter, undefeated at the moment, but I think Hrgović dusts him off easily enough at no matter what point of their career that they're both at. So Adam says would like to see Hrgović versus Chisora. That would be an interesting fight, and I think for someone like Derek Chisora, who's been operating at a higher level, he would see that unless he was guaranteed some big money. It's a pretty risky fight for not much reward. So Ortiz is celebrating his 70th birthday, says Easy Peel. Ruthless. L-Dog says Adam Fahey, it's a perfect match for Hrgović. Okay. So Manuman666, best boxing channel going. Hopefully you're referring to this one and not someone else's. But if you are referring to Boxing Squared, this channel, thank you very much. So I will just try to get through these comments as quickly as I can before moving on to the next topic, which I was going to sort of come back to Povetkin and Hunter. I see, if you've seen my preview video, I have Hunter winning that either by points or late stoppage. I'm just not convinced Povetkin's got that much left in the tank. The Fury fight and even the Joshua fight, I do think he is going to slow down and fade as the fight goes on. He'll start fast, he'll be fresh, he'll look good, it'll be competitive. This is going to be a competitive fight, but the deeper the fight goes, I think if Hunter is using movement, working Povetkin around, I think that is going to be in his advantage, and I think he'll pick up a lot of those later rounds and tiring Povetkin out, stealing some of the rounds, and maybe even stopping him late on. How do you see that one playing out? And I'll probably get to your comment if you leave one on that in about 5 or 10 minutes, so apologies for that. So just getting to the next comments. Hunter has no shot at becoming a world champion. Just feed him to Hrgović, who does have a chance of becoming a champ, says L-Dog. Well, I'm not sure Hunter would believe that, but I do think that Michael Hunter will reach a ceiling at some point in the division. I think he is capable of being a good top 10 fighter, but there's a number of guys who end up joining the top 10 who end up bottoming out just because the opposition, the competition towards that top 5 end of the division is, they separate themselves. And I think Hunter would sort of fall victim to that. I do think that a lot of these bigger guys would end up having good success against Michael Hunter, especially the guys that can box. So L-Dog says Hrgović versus Martin Bakole would be a good fight. I hope that's Hrgovic's next fight. And actually, I think that that would be a fight, Martin Bakole. He's got a lot of confidence right now. He seems to be kind of like Michael Hunter. He's accepting of a lot of challenges. He wants to fight a Daniel Dubois. I could see him going, yep, I'll chance my arm, because it can be one of these things where he can have a breakthrough fight if he could upset someone like a Hrgović. I would be going with Hrgović in that instance, though. So Unrivaled Boxing Talker News said Hunter's not a gimme fight for Hrgović. Hunter could be a very bad style for Hrgović. I think I would lean towards Hrgović in that, but it's certainly no gimme. That would be a tough fight. Michael Hunter is no joke. Where are we now? L-Dog says, after Molina, I think Hrgović should fight Martin Bakole and then Derek Chisora. Well, it's up to his promoters to really get him into some better matchups for next year, 2020. So Malas, okay, he's talking to someone else there. So Sam Holtman says, I genuinely believe that a prime Mike Tyson before Don King and all the fame and money would have been the greatest heavyweight of all time. Well, life choices and all that sort of stuff, shoulda, coulda, woulda. A lot of the guys that end up having the best careers end up leading relatively, I don't want to say limited lifestyles. I mean, people often describe Spartan existence for top fighters that can stay focused and maintain that focus over a long period of time. But the trappings of fame and money, that does catch a lot of people. And if I was, had that sort of fame like Mike Tyson, I could easily go off the rails too. So Unger says politics robbed Ali of his prime. It certainly did. He lost, 3 years or so, just because of the army draft stuff. So L-Dog says, my opinion is right because I wouldn't have that opinion otherwise. Okay, I think there's an argument over Filip Hrgović and Michael Hunter who wins there. Agent 007 says Eric Molina is a good opponent for him. At 9 fights in, this is being his 10th, I don't mind it. It's not so bad. It's not a great fight in terms of where Eric Molina is currently at, but it's a good resume builder. So Jason Lander said, did you enjoy Tyson in the WWE? I can't say that I bought the pay-per-view. I don't watch wrestling. But it's good promotion for him. I did see ahead of the fight he was saying he was going to do his new move, the Dossa drop or whatever it was. Fully scripted. Probably going to see another return from Tyson Fury, a rematch of some sort. So there's going to be some sort of follow-up to this, and possibly even this year. And given it's going to be, 1, 2, 3, about 4 months till he faces Deontay Wilder, if Wilder gets past Ortiz, and it still happens in February 2020, Fury will need something to keep him occupied before he goes back into a camp. So Heavy D says, good morning from the UK. Good morning to you too. Good evening to others who've joined the chat. It's showing that I've got 0 people in the chat now. Maybe the chat has gone off. Oh no, there's some live commentary coming in. So I'm not sure what's happened here. I will just, if you can actually hear me, because it says I'm live, but I can't see anyone in the chat at the moment in terms of watching, just let me know. So Salty Sally says, want to see the top 30 heavyweights in a Royal Rumble. It would be good actually, maybe not so much of a Royal Rumble, but if there was a World Boxing Super Series, I would love to see that. That would be fantastic. I mean, even if it was within the different promotional stables, if they could have a little 6-man tournament or, I don't know, something over the course of 6 months, because let's face it, in 2020, there's going to be a lot of fights that will be tied up at the top end of the division with the rematches, mandatories, all that sort of stuff. Could ultimately have a lot of guys from the outside looking in, where they're going to have to do something in a tournament of some format, even if it's not WBSS, something else. That would certainly be good for fans. So Easy Peel says, what's happening with Ajit Kabayal? He seems to have gone off the radar. 1 fight for 2018, 1 fight in 2019. He's joined Top Rank on a co-promotional arrangement with SES Boxing. In the press release when he joined, it said he was either going to be fighting either late in 2019 or first quarter of 2020. So it probably is going to be next year at this point. Okay, so we'll get to the next topic. I see Scott70 has raised Bacoli to carry Hernandez for a points decision this weekend. So that is one of the few heavyweight fights that is on this weekend of any note. And Bacoli is still a prospect sort of under construction. There's a couple of other guys that have been in Anthony Joshua's training camp that are going to be fighting this weekend, Albon Pervizage, and also we have Timothy Moten. But Bacoli, he's going to be on a matchroom card in Manchester fighting Rodney Hernandez. Hernandez, a couple of decent wins on his record. His record's probably, it looks worse than he really is. He's actually a decent heavyweight and a guy very durable. But in terms of Bacoli and what the result will be, I could see it actually being something similar to the FA Jagba fight, which with Rodney Hernandez. May end up being sort of 5 or 6 rounds with Bacoli sort of, I don't want to say dominating, but in control for the most part, and then Bacoli starting to tee off as the fight starts to wear on. And Hernandez was stopped on his feet against the Jagba. I could totally see something happening like that. But Scott is predicting a points win for Bacoli. I'm not actually sure how long that fight is. Is that an 8-rounder? It wouldn't surprise me if Hernandez was able to go all 8. So L-Dog says, after Molina, we need to see Hrgović versus Bacoli, then Chisora. Okay, we've covered that. Feroz says, Wilder versus Ortiz promo, 2.25 million. Wilder is now the face of boxing. It's 2.2 million. But we have to remember that was free to air. That's a very different thing to pay-per-view. And it was in a good slot on Fox. So it's very good for the promotion, but whether that translates into extra buys, we'll have to see, because if ultimately it does 250,000 buys, that's probably not the face of boxing. Heavy D says, anybody see Fury fight yesterday? That right hand. Can't say that I caught it, as I mentioned before, but great for promotion for a potential rematch with Wilder and building his profile. So L-Dog says, Trevor Bryan hasn't lost, hashtag Trev Squad. It'd be interesting to see what's going to happen with Trevor Bryan. Obviously, he was looking to fight Manuel Cha. The deal never got done. They would have been fighting November 2nd. That was going to be in Zaire. Unga says, Hernandez is durable and tough, not easy to stop. Yeah, if he does get stopped, and albeit on his feet, he'll be taking a lot of punishment before that happens. He had a good win last year against Laron Mitchell. He had a good fight against Joey DeWeco. I actually thought that Hernandez either drew that fight or even possibly nicked it, but it ended up being horrifically wide to Joey DeWeco. True 2022 says, hope it's not a long walk to the ring for Ortiz. In what context? Of tiring him out because he's old, or is that what you're implying? So Mala says, Feroz, the biggest fight is AJ Ruiz. Wilder is not the face of boxing. More people still know who AJ is. Well, I think if there's a face of boxing, in terms of boxing more broadly, I mean, it's probably Canelo Alvarez at this point, but in terms of the heavyweight division, Joshua's the cash cow. We've got Fury and Wilder undefeated. Andy Ruiz Jr. with 3 belts. As I did that video, there is no one dominant heavyweight right now. So L-Dog says, Okoli versus Hughie Fury. If you don't fall asleep, you'll get a refund for your tickets. Okay. So Unrivaled Boxing Talk and News says, Boxing Squared, thoughts on Makhmudov possibly stepping up after Peters. I was talking about this in a stream a week or two ago, that Aslanbek Makhmudov in Canada, he's become a big fish in a small pond. And he's sort of reaching that point, because I think this will be his 10th fight. I think he's 9-0 at the moment, with Eye of the Tiger Management, which has been sort of looking after him. I think they need to strike out on some sort of co-promotional deal, either with the Top Rank or a PBC or a Matchroom in the United States, because he's outgrowing, 1, the Canadian scene, but 2, I think just in general, like some of these other guys who are entering into a lot of co-promotional arrangements, at a certain point, they can't get the fights that their fighters need, and he's certainly reaching that point. Samuel Peter, I just can't see that at this point that this was of any real benefit for Aslanbek Makhmudov. I mean, he's durable, he might be able to go some rounds, but I mean, he's going to put a beating on Samuel Peter. That fight, December 7th, and we also have Simon King on that undercard facing Sergey Lyakovich, which he's another guy, and this is, they're part of that sort of same sort of stable there. Lyakovich at 43 years old and Samuel Peter at, who knows, apparently 39. We'll have to see what happens with Makhmudov, but I think he needs to branch out onto some sort of co-promotional arrangement just for the sake of his career. So Sam says, Adam Fahey says, Okoli almost put me to sleep last weekend. And he did too, because that was quite early here in New Zealand. It was, I want to say 7:30 when he came up, and I'd, only had about 5 hours sleep. I almost fell asleep. And it was just that hugging, just couldn't stop it. It was awful. Okay, where did we get to? Sorry, the chat just went off on a random... Okay, I'm just scrolling up here. Sorry, just bear with me. There's a lot of comments. So apologies if it's taking a lot of time to get to your comment, or if I've accidentally missed it. Jeez, where are we? So Jason says, Hughie Fury versus sleeping pills. Who sends you to sleep first? Ruthless. So True 2022 says 40 isn't old anymore. I think there seems to be, I mean, I know a lot of people are saying that. A lot of people are saying that heavyweights, the last thing to go was power. But Outside of one or two examples, there's not too many guys at 40 years old in the heavyweight division that are really campaigning and having a lot of success. Take away Vladimir Klitschko, the odd other contender, Alexander Povetkin's had reasonable success, Luis Ortiz, but, they are the exception rather than the rule. And as it is with Ortiz and Povetkin, certainly they haven't been dominating the division, and they are past prime at this point. So L-Dog says, to be honest, Joseph Parker is pretty boring to watch as well. Oh, dagger to my heart. So Unrivaled Boxing Talk and News says, who you got between Milas and Zarkozy if it happened? Well, that's interesting because, Zarkozy is such a big unit, but he's not the finished product yet. I do like, the way that he's been developing, but obviously he's got a ways to go. Peter Milas is a pretty polished guy. I like, he's got good power, fast hands, good footwork. And he's beaten a couple of guys, like he was looking good against Kevin Johnson before Johnson was stopped on cuts. And he sort of dusted off Francesco Pianetta as well. That would be a competitive fight. I think that would end up coming down to a decision. And if Zarkozy can keep it long, stop Milas from getting to the inside, maybe, it depends how long is the fight too. Because Zarkozy, maybe some questions about his gas tank. But recently when he fought Kevin Johnson, who seemingly fought everyone, he looked pretty good, but Johnson was pretty low volume. So Zarkozy was able to do those rounds comfortably enough. But maybe Zarkozy by decision, and maybe it depends on when it happens too. Because if it's in a year or two, maybe I would lean towards Zarkozy more. It's pretty much a 50-50 at this point, I think. So Alan says, been a boxing fan 30 years, slowly moving to MMA because of the WBC. I think there's all manner of reasons why boxing fans transition to other sports or just sort of, fall out of watching boxing altogether. It can just happen. And some of the BS that happens, who could blame anyone? Who do you think the next world champ, says Stefan? Do you mean in the heavyweight division? Well, I guess the next opportunity is Luis Ortiz. There's, November 23rd, he could pull off an upset. After that, we've got that rematch between Joshua and Ruiz. For me, that's a 50-50. It depends what adjustments can Joshua make. Can he keep it long against Andy Ruiz Jr.? Can he really pop that jab and make him pay? Don't let him get to the inside. That was something even before those knockdowns that Ruiz was closing the distance with ease. That's something Joshua's just got to, not allow. So Let's Visit said, I'll be watching how they bring along Triple D in 2020. And do you think Joyce and Dubois will fight? Yeah, I do think they will. I think there will end up being something in maybe late 2020. I think Joyce may end up being one of those sort of final pieces of the puzzle before Daniel Dubois steps up to the real top end of the division, the real sort of 5 or 6 guys. Joyce is a very sturdy test, but he might still be seen as a step by Frank Warren. And at some point, Frank Warren's going to want to clip the ticket on that. But he's got to build that fight. And that's the thing that he didn't do very well, I don't believe, with Nathan Gorman and Daniel Dubois. They talked about that fight for a long time, but I don't think boxing fans ever really got excited about it, even though it was going to be a decent fight. And ultimately, Dubois dominated that one. But in terms of will Frank Warren do that next year, I could see that happening, but I think some of that depends on the arc of Joe Joyce. If he ended up having a fight and losing it, maybe that makes the Dubois fight more possible. But if he continues to win and he's working his own way, they're not just going to burn him off against Dubois. Lots of ifs, buts, and maybes. But Frank Warren, as soon as he got Joyce into the stable, he threw Gorman to the wolves in terms of feeding him to Dubois. And eventually he will feed Joyce to Dubois as well. Maybe it's not for 12 or 18 months, but it'll happen at some point if Joyce stays in the Frank Warren stable. Given he's moved around a little bit, nothing is guaranteed there either. So Adam says Price has 2 paydays left, Dubois and Herkovich. He's trying to give the guy brain damage. Unger says, Alan Bennett, come on man, how can any fan of the last 30 years leave now after all the WBA BS? Yeah, each to their own in terms of why people leave boxing. I know it is a hard sport to stomach and swallow sometimes. You know, the corruption that pervades the sport, sometimes just the outright unfairness of the politics. In terms of the next comment, so Michael says, I finally caught you live. That's a feat here on the East Coast. It's 5 a.m. Geez, what are you doing up so early there, Michael? That is early. So L-Dog says, Hrgovic will be the next heavyweight king. Mark my words, Klitschko era V2. Well, I think the Hrgovic era is still taking off, but it's probably maybe 18 months to 2 years before really taking hold. So Toby says, good luck in rugby. Thank you very much. WBA streets ahead of WBC for most Rancid. Well, they're all Rancid, aren't they? Unrivaled Boxing Talk and News says, everyone hit the like to support the channel. Yes, please. We've got 44 in the chat. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining me. Thank you for being here, part of the live stream. So Theamus says, I support the channel with my presence. #humble. Well, thank you for gracing us with your presence. Michael says, hit the like. Yes, please. UK Nelly says, PBC don't recognise the WBO. Okay, I must have missed that. What that's in response to. So Scott says, 55 in the chat, 22 likes. Jab the like button, girls and boys. Yes, please. Watcher says, thoughts on Jeff Horn and Australian boxing as a whole? Well, I'm not going to make out that I'm an expert on Australian boxing because I'm not from Australia, and to be honest, I don't follow the Australian boxing scene all that closely on the whole. But in terms of Jeff Horn, well, that Zerafa fight, the first one, obviously he was dusted off, and it was a pretty competitive fight, and then it went downhill pretty quickly. I think the same could happen again, and I saw that there was a pretty fiery press conference for the launch of the second fight. I think Zerafa probably by the same result. In terms of Australian boxing as a whole, hard for me to comment, not being there, not really covering it, but probably similar to New Zealand. You know, there's a sprinkling of talent that ends up having to go further afield. There's not a lot of depth in New Zealand boxing where I am, and I think that's probably the same for Australian boxing. Not at the amateur levels, but in the pros. And pro boxers in both countries, from what I've heard and what I know, they find it pretty tough to, you know, it's a real graft to earn a living. So Croesus says, I'm pretty surprised how Martin Piccoli bounced back. Well, I think they went into that fight with Michael Hunter, 2018, confident and overly confident. And that fight exposed, some deficiencies in the way that he was training. Some of, you know, even he wasn't eating on the day of the fight. There were some other things going on. He needed to change up some of his training methods, but also, I think we saw in a lot of that fight, it was just looking to unload massive shots, and Michael Hunter just wasn't there when he was throwing them, and they're just finding fresh air. But he has made the changes, and maybe that loss at that point in his career is going to be the best thing that ever happened to Martin Piccoli, because he's able to actually make adjustments. He was put up against a guy on the night who was better than him, made him work, and ultimately he has improved, and I think we've seen it in some of these fights against Marius Wok, for example. There was that one against Perrier. It looked pretty good in that. Also, that one just the other week against Kevin Johnson. I mean, not too many people have stopped Kevin Johnson. The fact that he did that, I mean, albeit Kevin Johnson is pretty rinsed these days, but he's still durable, still goes rounds with lots of prospects. So you can take some credit from a Johnson win still. Maybe not as much as it used to be, but you can get some credit. So Jim says, is it just me, or has it been a rather disappointing year for the heavyweight division? My Larry Holmes box set has been put to good use. Yeah, it really has been a disappointing year overall. There just hasn't been even though we've got more cards than we've had, you know, maybe ever, it just seems to be, there is fewer fights. I don't know. Certainly fewer big fights, but in general, I mean, this weekend sort of typifies what I've been sort of saying about every 2 out of 4 weekends of a month seems to be there's almost no big heavyweight fights on. And sometimes there's no even real sort of middling heavyweight fights in a week, and you've got a couple of prospects, you know, facing off somewhere at the back of beyond of Timbuktu. But yeah, it has been disappointing. 1, for the volume of heavyweight fights, but 2, often the matchmaking. It's been absolutely dreadful. So Michael says, Brown challenged by young Aussie fighter. Yes, he was. And if you go to my backup channel, 99 Boxing, I did upload a little montage of that earlier today with Dempsey McKean calling out Lucas Brown. And Brown sort of saying, thanks, but no thanks. I don't want to take you on a week's notice, but let's do it in March 2020 when your promoter wanted me to fight you. So it looks like Dempsey McKean and Lucas Brown may actually square off in 2020. Just going down here. As they faced each other at cruiserweight, I'd like to see Usyk versus Hunter, says Sam Holtman. Well, you never know. If Usyk ends up picking up a vacant title, he may well end up, Hunter might end up being in his sort of orbit in terms of a voluntary defense or even a mandatory down the line. I could see Hunter and Usyk, that happening at heavyweight. It was a good fight at cruiserweight. So why was Avni Yildirim given the WBC mandatory position 6 months after failing a drugs test, and White has to wait 18 months even if he's clean? Is this favoritism for PBC fighters from WBC? Yeah, I don't know all the ins and outs of the Yildirim situation, but I believe that there was some sort of mitigating circumstances with that. Not that cleared him, but ultimately reduced the sort of punishment that he was going to receive. Because that surprised me as well, because I was like, oh, hang on, didn't he actually just test positive just a little while ago? I'm surprised after him getting starched by Eubank just, what was it, a year, 18 months ago, that he managed to get into position so quickly for another title shot. That surprised me big time. So Sam says, still would like to see Chisora versus Parker. Yeah, I'd still like to see it, but there's part of me that's like, it's been talked about all year and it's not happened. Is it one of these fights that are just, it slides by, I don't really care about anymore? Yeah, I'm not as amped for it as I once was. So Michael says, I'd like to see Chisora versus Usyk too. I think Chisora is ready for a step up. I actually, and this is an unpopular opinion, I know that there's a lot of people back sort of quite high on Derek Chisora, but I do believe that on the back of knocking out David Price, who's domestic level, the back of knocking out a faded Artis Bilka, that I don't want to say that they weren't good performances, because they were, but that doesn't mean that he's sort of, knocking on the door of a world title. There sort of seems to be a real push behind Derek Chisora, and maybe people are overestimating where his position really is within the heavyweight division. I think he's just solidified that he's sort of a top 20 guy, that he's in that region, but he'd need to fight better opposition to prove that, one, he's a top 10 fighter, but two, that he can do anything at world level, because those weren't world level fights against Bilka and Price. So Unger says, Matthew Goodyear, Yildirim was investigated and had a hearing and was cleared. Okay. Michael says, what about Chisora Ortiz after Wilder beats him? Well, if the money is there, Derek Chisora will fight anyone. And if Ortiz is willing to travel, because I'm sure that they would try to have that at the O2, I could see that headlining a card. That'd be a decent fight. So the Kissim says, hi Boxing Squid from Bangkok, Taylor versus Tank, how you see it. I was surprised at that call out. Certainly Tank Davis, a very good fighter, but, climbing up, big divisions. I mean, was he featherweight? He's just been at 130. He's barely made it to 135, and all of a sudden he's talking about taking out Josh Taylor. I think that is a call out for a bit of profile. It's a shame, because Tank Davis is so talented, but he's not fighting anyone interesting right now. And if you follow Del Boy's channel, that's Blue Collar Sports TV, he's certainly been covering the sort of career of Tank Davis quite carefully, and pointed out that they're actually not matching him with anyone that we'd largely want to see him with. So he has to resort to calling out the likes of Josh Taylor. He should have been fighting the best guys in his division, but seemingly he's been sort of guided away from that. And it's sad, because, he's a young champion with a lot of skill and a lot of power. So Cressus says, would like to really see another fight within the young prospects, Bacoli versus Hunter. That fight was lit. Unexpectedly so as well. I mean, Hunter at that point was still making his way, having just had a couple of lower level fights at heavyweight. That announced himself to the heavyweight division, and that ended up being, I think, a fight that in retrospect has been viewed as a pretty good fight overall. And at the time, I think it was it didn't really get a lot of profile until the actual fight happened. It went very under the radar, and it was a good fight. So JPK World says, I would not be surprised if Povetkin lands early and takes Hunter out, but I'm edging towards Hunter by decision. I'm sort of going that way, or Hunter by late stoppage. But I just think, if this was Povetkin 2 or 3 years ago, I'd probably be leaning that way. It's going to be a good competitive fight, but I do think that Hunter is going to slowly start taking over. He does have the height. He does have the reach, I think. He will be working the jab, working the angles, and I think Povetkin at 40 is just past his best, and I'm edging it to Hunter. So Michael Woodward says Chisora has been more fit with Hay. He was beating White before he got KO'd. I think his fitness has been good under Hay, and obviously Ruben Tabar is sort of whipping him into shape on the fitness front. But at the end of the day, I mean, fitness doesn't change your chin resistance. He got knocked out pretty brutally in that one. And I think people forget Chisora, was only less than a year ago knocked out brutally by White. Sure, he was up on 2 of the judges' scorecards there, but the result was what it was. And you've got Spilka and Price on the resume since. Those fights don't make him, competing and being a world-level fighter at this point. Not for me, at least. Scrolling. So Unga says, too many fanboys in here. Talk boxing. That's just part and parcel of it, isn't it? People are very passionate about their fighters. Okay, so we've just got down to the piece where I asked if I was still live. That must have been about 10 minutes ago, so apologies. I'm slipped way far behind here. I'll try to catch up quickly. We've already been over a lot of these questions that I'm having a look at the moment. Thank you for telling me that the feed was working. What I might do is actually, I'll just get back to just see what my other topics were. Oh, one thing I should let you know, there's a lot of commentary in that video that I did, who was going to be emerge as the #1 heavyweight. And that was more of like a mini documentary style video. So I had a different intro for that in terms of the music. And I must have had about 30-ish comments about the intro. About 80% hated the intro that was used for that video, saying go back to the old one, and about 20% said thank you for the new intro, I love it, I didn't like the old one. So I just thought I should clarify. So it was a different style of video, and for stuff like that I often do sort of mess around a little bit and do a couple of different bits and pieces to what I would normally do. So my channel intro is still the same. That was just a slightly different style a video. So we've covered Povetkin, we've covered Piccoli, we've covered Hrgovic, Dempsey McKean calling out Lucas Brown, we've covered that, Patreon questions, Andy Ruiz Jr., yeah, so you may have seen that he's been sparring with Michael Hunter, and he does look like he has been trimming down. I know there's been a lot of debate about how much weight he's lost and, how far he'll sort of go down from the first fight, etc. But I think there's a couple of things, and I pointed this out in my video that I put up on the channel just earlier today. I mean, we have to also consider, where did he start camp at? Because he was well over his fight weight from June when he entered camp. He might have been 15 or 20 pounds heavier. So if you ended up being 290 pounds entering camp, losing 30, he might be 260-ish. So I think there's been a lot of sort of shroud waving around that sort of stuff, and had some comments on some different videos in the last week or two suggesting he could make cruiserweight, or he's going to come in at 220 pounds. I think let's take it away from that end of town, because that's not realistic. His lightest weight as a professional is in the mid 240s. So I don't think we're going to see him come in any lower than that, but it's probably going to be somewhere around 255 to 260-ish. A weight he's looked good at, a weight he's looked powerful at. 268 in the context of his career was a higher weight that he normally comes in at. He was 262 for Dimitrenko, 255 for Joseph Parker. So, I mean, I would expect anything between 255 and 262. Maybe he'll get a little bit lower. I guess it depends. I mean, what sort of fitness level does he have? I mean, if they believe that it's going to be Joshua running for 12 rounds, maybe he will come in a little bit lighter in terms of under 255, because ultimately the extra rubble may actually hinder, not help him. I mean, the argument for the first fight from Ruiz Jr. was he wanted to be a little bit heavier. He was 268 to have more sort of meat on his punches. But it could be a very different fight the second time around. Joshua could well use that height and reach advantage that he's got. 8 inches in reach advantage. He'd be silly not to. I think we're going to see another fight from the taller man that's going to utilize those advantages. So Ruiz has really got to probably try harder than the first fight to close the distance and get his work away. But it's possible. He can certainly do it. But I think Ruiz Jr. and Hunter, I like that they're sparring together, because I think for both, that's a great move. So getting back to the chat here, so if you want to sort of drop some comments on that, what I was just talking about, Ruiz, his weight, the sparring with Michael Hunter, I will get to it probably in about 3 hours when I catch up on the chat. Have you seen the YouTube channel YBLDBC Slayer? Very funny boxing channel. Yeah, I remember when it was, he used to have another channel. This is, I mean, others may have seen it when it was going. It was actually called Young Boxing. So this is before it got shut down for, I think, multiple violations for copyright or something like that. Yeah, I can't say I watch a lot of his content, but I know that he does have a healthy following. Where did we get to? Looks like I'm caught up on the chat by mistake. I've actually scrolled past lots of comments. So if I've written something, if you've written something and I've missed it and it's a question to me rather than responding to someone else, drop it again and I'll try to catch up on it. So I'm just on this last page here. So Ungus says, Heyman is great for his boxers but bad for fans. His fighters certainly do love him, and they express that at any opportunity. So he clearly looks after them and their interests, which is that is nice. Michael Woodward says, "What the hat? Gore Heyman specific. I have Hearns, many lies, and Aram's documented decades of corruption. What you got?" Okay, there must have been a beef in the commentary in the chat about different promoters and stables. So Matt says, Boxing Squared, what's your favorite YouTube channels? Actually, too many to list. I think on my Boxing Squared account, I follow about 40 different channels. And on my other account, 99 Boxing, which before I had it as my backup channel, was the channel that I watched YouTube videos on, I must be subscribed to about 100 different channels. Like literally, there's too many to list. But there's a lot of very good channels out there. I'm sort of more into watching channels that actually delve into not so much drama type channels. I think I sort of gravitate to a lot of channels like myself that like doing news, analysis, that sort of stuff. So yeah, and it's ironic because I think there's a lot of big channels, and I think it's one of these things as well. And tell me if your experience is similar here as well with YouTube. Like, I must have been watching boxing videos on YouTube for about 5 years now, and a lot of the channels that I watch now are not necessarily the ones that I used to watch. But it's not because, I mean, some of them just don't exist anymore. They've either been shut down, closed down. But sometimes your tastes change over time in terms of what sort of content you want at a different point in time. And sometimes you can get too much of a good thing. You end up watching someone for years and years and years. And I mean, there's a couple of channels lately that I just haven't been watching any of. I think just because I watched them for almost about 3 years in a row, almost every single video. And I think sometimes your cup can just sort of runneth over, and you probably, like me, like to sort of have a look around, see what people are doing in terms of the content and the analysis. And yeah, I mean, certainly I'm drawn more to sort of the newsy sort of style channels with news and analysis. I think similar to the sort of stuff that I do, because that's the sort of stuff I like to do and like to sort of have in return when I'm watching the YouTube videos. But yeah, I mean, too many channels to list, actually. I mean, like 100 or so that I'm subscribed to on my channel 99 Boxing. Where are we now? So Matthew says, has Miller joined Top Rank? All but. So they've agreed to a deal, but he's yet to sign it. So technically he hasn't signed, but he is in the process of doing so. Matthew says, what's happened to Rostislav Klitschko? 13 first-round knockouts. Your guess is as good as mine. He's just gone completely off the reservation, done a Tyson Fury, and just, gone off into the world. He's a guy that loves the celebrity lifestyle. He's a star in his country. He's doing other things other than boxing, and he's been out of the ring for more than a year now. And yeah, who knows really why. So God of War says, Boxing Squared UK Rob said he sent you something in a Twitter DM. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, I accidentally skipped across like 100 comments or something. So apologies for missing different comments. So I'm all caught up now. So if you do have something, we'll go for another 10 minutes or so, I think. What are we up to at the moment? 1 hour 15. So much for doing a 40 to 50 minute stream. And it always never works out that way. So James Burrell, so Unger says, James Burrell, Gary Russell doesn't want to fight. Al making him that coin, only fighting once a year. You guys just don't get it. I mean, in some of these boxes, it's, I think as fans, so Unger's sort of raising a point there that sometimes risk and reward, the equation can be quite good for a fighter in terms of what they can get for who they're fighting. They may only have to fight once a year and earn $1 or $2 million. And I think as fans, we often look at some of these situations and go, why isn't he after the glory? Why isn't he fighting the best? But sometimes, the situation and the status quo, which is the way that they're being directed, is actually good for them in their circumstances. And I know that, we all want everyone fighting the best all the time, but sometimes the realities of keeping belts in-house in promotional stables, that takes over. It is what it is. I mean, that's part of the thing that turns people off boxing as well. The best not fighting the best. So UK Rob, check your DM. Okay, I will. When I get off here, I'll have a listen. I will definitely. So you say it's audio regarding the White situation. Okay. I'm very interested now. Obviously, I can't listen because I'm tapped in on the microphone here, but I will definitely go to my DM after this. So, L Dog had asked, what's your personal pound-for-pound top 10? You know what? I don't do them. I just think that's fraught with... It's too subjective. Even heavyweight top 10s, I try not to do them too often, just because it moves around so quickly and it's so subjective. I mean, I have personal views about who would be there, but yeah, I try to get away from the sort of pound for pounds and the sort of vagaries of doing that. So Audi alias TT says, morning beer, shout out from the UK. Will AJ break up belts if he beats Ruiz? It sort of depends, because I could well see a situation where either two things could happen, or three things, I guess. Is one, you drop a belt could be vacated. Two, he could end up fighting Kubrat Pulev next, pay Alexander Usyk some step-aside money to delay, because remember, WBO and IBF, it's a collision course, who's going to happen next, and The WBO was meant to be next in the rotation, but then the IBF has put out a ruling saying Pulev must get a shot by the end of 31st May. Joshua's not going to get both in if he wins his belts, both in before the end of May, both mandatories, that is. So it could end up being, he drops a belt, pays Usyk step aside, and comes to some sort of agreement with the WBO to push it up, or it could be just, it's the third option, an agreement with the WBO to do it immediately after, that there will be no other fight before the WBO is fought for, say in like September of 2020. Yeah, so Unger just reiterating the point that I was just making. These guys grew up in real poverty and now cashing $2 million checks. And if you're fighting once a year, and it's, I don't want to say easy work, but you're getting $2 million, that can be an attractive proposition. And sometimes they don't have the cards, but yeah, some of those guys like Gary Russell Jr. should be fighting more often. So Matt says, Boxing Squared, what's your thoughts on all the trashy boxing YouTube channels from the UK? IFL, Hatman, do you think they're good for the sport, always pushing gossip rather than the sport? Well, I mean, I don't like to sort of trash other YouTube channels, and I try not to mention other YouTube channels by name, and I try not to get involved in back and forth and beefs, because that's not what I got into YouTube for. And for me, it's a good creative outlet. I like the sport. I was following it so closely, and I thought, well, actually, I could do this. And I know a lot of people probably don't know this, but I had a background in journalism, so I had a good sort of start on how I would want to sort of do my content. But in terms of what other people are doing, yeah, I mean, that's for them to run their channel how they see fit. I mean, I know I like to do things a certain way, and that works for me. But how other people do it, and if they're pushing gossip rather than the sport, well, that's over to them. I mean, and I'm not completely innocent of having, put stuff out and then ultimately it's not come to pass. But, I tried to make my stuff as much as possible in terms of the information that I'm putting out accurate as possible, and giving an honest and, objective analysis of any sort of given situation. It's not always easy, and sometimes it obviously doesn't happen, but hopefully people like the content that I do. As for other people's, that's over to them to run their channel how they see fit. So, Audi, who are you picking for Ruiz or Joshua? That's tough. I keep going back and forth on that, because if Joshua can implement a strict game plan, and stick to it, he should be able to maximize his advantages to win rounds and take a decision. But is he able to stay disciplined for an entire 12 rounds on a guy that's going to be constantly trying to get up on his chest with fast hands, throwing punches and bunches? I could totally see Andy Ruiz Jr. winning again, but then I could see Joshua winning it too. He has shown before in some fights, like the Parker one, he can fight to a plan. But, Ruiz is a different fighter to Parker, obviously a pressure fighter. And he's a bit smaller than Parker. And, yeah, it's not going to be easy for both guys. I know some people are saying that Ruiz is going to win easy. But as Manny Robles had said, the first fight wasn't easy. The second won't be either. So Audi says, BS, will Dillian ever be given a crack at Wilder? Well, I guess in the context of this whole situation that he's involved in with UCAD or whatever, if he clears it, then his mandatory situation is reinstated, and he'll get a crack at the title holder in 2021. I mean, will Wilder be champion by that time? That's another question, probably for another day. He's 34 now. He's coming towards the end of his prime years, I believe. There's going to be some challenges in 2020. Tyson Fury won't be an easy beat. So, Wilder's got it all ahead of him. But Dillian Whyte, will he get a shot at the WBC? If he's cleared and if he sticks it out, he'll get a shot. But will that be against Wilder? Who knows? So Matthew says, which of these US lightweights is most talented? Teofimo Lopez, Haney, or Ryan Garcia? That's a tough question. I mean, there's a lot of hype around Haney at the moment, and Same goes to some extent for Teofimo Lopez and also Garcia. I mean, there were a few holes that I sort of saw in Lopez's last performance against that Japanese guy, but that was a good fight, and that was probably a fight that he needed. I'm not totally convinced on Ryan Garcia yet, and I probably haven't seen enough of Devin Haney, but those are three decent names. Who is the most talented, though? I'll pass on that one, but they're all good fighters. So James Burrell says White needs to go to Alabama and pull up on Wilder in person with cameras rolling. That would, people would absolutely lose their minds if that happened. Falling behind the chat already. Okay, I've got to speed up on some of these answers. Anyone see the great shape Ortiz is in heading into the rematch with Wilder? He said he's currently 239 pounds. Well, that's actually around where he normally comes in. So I sort of thought, he looks in good shape. Obviously, it's 3 weeks away. I think he'll probably end up staying somewhere around that. He's normally around that sort of 230 to 240-ish range anyway. BS, what's the reason for franchise champion? UK boxing channels are great, just like some American. In terms of franchise champion, yeah, it's a little weird because I can see what the WBC is trying to do, but in the end it just makes it another hurdle, one to, as people have pointed out, undisputed fights, but it does seem to devalue their belts, and if you look at it that way, because if you go up working towards a belt and you can never get a shot against the best guy in the division, yeah, it's not ideal. So Wakatu Wilkie says, cool boxing squid, almost 20k subs, been watching since you started, keep it up, keepy. Thank you, Wakatu. Yeah, slowly approaching 20,000 subscribers. Got to say, the last few months, with the very few fights that have been on offer in terms of big ones, it's been a bit of a slower time for the channel in terms of, not anyone, most of the people that are watching the stream, I know that you've been following the channel for some time, and you've been part of, watching and commenting on videos, etc. But in terms of how the channel sort of grows is when you come up to bigger fights, that's when the content that you do gets exposed to more people. Like I've noticed some of the stuff that I've been doing for the rematch for Ruiz and Joshua, that's getting more people sort of exposed to the channel. But we really have in 2019, as Jim was pointing out earlier, it just hasn't really been a great year for heavyweight boxing. Not as many big fights, a lot of mismatches. It's just been a little bit sort of, few and far between. I think in 2018, it really was a pretty decent year. Every sort of weekend, bar about 4 or 5 weeks of the year, there was something to look forward to. It hasn't been as, bountiful in 2019 for some reason, even though we got more cards, which is the strange thing. So Matt says, to be fair to White, was nice for him to fail the drugs test. Got my 20 back as he failed the test before his pay-per-view. Oh, is that from betting? So Michael says Rigo versus Inoue. Hasn't Rigo moved up to like 126 or something at the moment? Got to say, under sort of 126, I can't say that I follow it too closely. Obviously been watching the World Boxing Super Series with Inoue. He's been doing his thing. But yeah, my knowledge at some of those lower weights, yeah, not great. So L-Dog says Devin Haney is not as good as people think. I believe Luke Campbell would beat him. Well, given Haney's being elevated to the champ, I wouldn't mind seeing that fight. I think given everything that happened with these whole, franchise champion, etc., with Lomachenko being elevated, be good to see Haney fight off against someone like a Campbell, or at least of that quality. Just lost my place in the chat here, catching up again. Apologies for that. We'll go for about another 5 minutes or so. So Tank fighting next month. That's against Gamboa, isn't it? And I think that's what I was talking about in terms of Tank Davis. And this is as I was alluding to Del Boy's Boxing News, or Blue Collar Sports TV now, has pointed out in a number of different videos that so much talent, just not fighting interesting enough fighters, and he's fallen victim to the inactivity curse, but then often fighting guys that are being brought up from lower weight classes and such. Where are we here? A lot of people debating about who is the most talented out of those three, with Devin Haney, Teofimo Lopez, and Ryan Garcia. Yeah, Ryan Garcia looks a little bit undercooked at the moment for me, but obviously, he's still a prospect. A lot of people having back and forth here. God of War says a lot of mismatches, delayed fights due to injuries and pairs. Also fighters just sitting there waiting for a title shot. Kovnatsky and Pulev, for example. Yeah, it sort of has been a lot of hurry up and wait this year, and I think there was a lot of optimism after what felt like pulling teeth in 2018 for Undisputed. That it was going to be the sort of payoff year. But as everything, boxing fans, long-suffering boxing fans, hurry up and wait. It always seems to be the way. So John Otter says, what do you think of Lucas Brown these days, Boxing Square? Do you think he will ever have a fight with your guy, Joseph Parker? Nah, no way. That's gone now. That fight was going to happen the end of 2017 or early 2018. Brown, he signed his portion of the contract, but Parker went on to fight Joshua. I mean, Lucas Brown is a journeyman now. He's 40 years old and not a lot of options, but he's as I sort of said ahead of the Dave Allen fight, he's a knockout waiting to happen. He's obviously hanging on for paydays, but I don't see Brown going anywhere. And I see UK Rob just said Brown versus Price, but I think Price at this point, even though he looked limited against Chisora, we saw what Price did to Allen. And I know triangle theories and all that sort of stuff, but Brown just wouldn't be able to close the distance. I just think David Price lands something early, the first couple of rounds, and knocks him out. Lucas Brown is chinny. So Unger says, can't complain about the fights of late. I was talking about heavyweight fights, but we have had some good fights in other divisions, which is good for me because I can, be a fan and watch them. We've had Thurman Pacquiao, Paul Spence, Vodsik, Bertabiev. Can't complain about them, and the other one I can bring to mind. Yeah, now we were talking about heavyweight, but in terms of all-round boxing and what we've been given, I mean, we've got a good one with Canelo and Sergey Kovalev this weekend. I know some people are saying this is a cherry pick, but Kovalev is a champion. He might be a little past prime, but, height, reach, he's a good puncher. It's not going to be easy for Canelo. He's going to have to work for the win. Oh, and of course, as Unger says, Prograis and Taylor. Yeah, we have been treated to some decent fights. And James says, I want Loma to go up one more weight and fight the winner of Taylor versus Ramirez next year. Taylor versus Ramirez is a good fight. Yeah, I sort of look at Lomachenko and go, is 147 a step too far? Kind of like Mikey Garcia going up to 147. That was a step too far in terms of the Spence fight. He was, comprehensively beaten. So Audi says, has Kovalev had enough rest? Will that hinder him? Well, I just think in terms of the schedule, because DAZN needed to have it on November the 2nd, so for billing reasons. I mean, if he loses or wins, he's still walking away with, $10 million-ish or whatever. I don't think he would mind at all. He's probably going to let it all hang out, and he's probably expecting he'll have to knock out Canelo Alvarez to get the win anyway. So who has the best win, Luis Ortiz or Derek Chisora? Probably Luis Ortiz. I mean, Bryant Jennings, that was a very good win at that point. I mean, who is Derek Chisora's best win? Carlos Takam, faded Carlos Takam. I think Luis Ortiz is probably got a better win with Jennings. So Rob says, 140 too much for Loma. I agree with that. I just sort of think that might be a step too far. And some talk here about him dropping back down to 130. I could see that. As the franchise champion too, I mean, it sounds like he's going to have some leeway with the WBC anyway. So we'll see what happens with him. Lots of back and forth here. UK Rob says Price is mentally shot. Yes and no. I mean, I think he was certainly in a worse place earlier in his career, but I think he's come to terms with his limitations. I think he knows who he is, and he probably knew that it was an uphill struggle against Derek Chisora, but his corner really did do him a favour. But yeah, it wasn't a good way to end the fight, and it does sort of, there used to be that whole sort of a David Price fight. It's going to be exciting for as long as it lasts. Some of that's kind of gone now, and I think people are kind of like, well, maybe he's just retire now. So UK Rob says he only threw the uppercut that made Chisora dip at the knees when he wasn't thinking. And that was right on the bell too. So Audi says Derek Chisora has had far harder fights on average. Old T's only fought Wilder. God of War says Chisora's best wins are losses, but at least he fought good fights against top guys. Yeah, I mean, he's been in some decent fights, but ultimately come up short. Okay, with a couple of messages deleted here. I'm not sure what they were. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up now. We're an hour and 35 into the chat. I'm desperate to get a drink, some water into me. It's a long way to hour 35 talking, not to have a drink. So I'm going to wrap it up now. So we've got 50 in the chat. So thank you for joining me. We'll be back next week, Friday night, New Zealand time, 9:30. So wherever in the world you are, UK, US, Canada, Australia, further afield, Africa, Asia, thank you for joining me. And please come again, and thank you for supporting the channel.